growing fires whose borders were defined by blinking red lights. Tolkazi walked to the master computer and ripped out the tape spool that contained the digital control codes. The spares were in the vault downstairs, and the only men within 10 kilometers who knew its combination were in this room, dead. Mohammed was busily ripping out every telephone in the room. The whole building shook with the explosion of a gasoline storage tank 2 kilometers away. The crashing sound of a hand grenade announced another move by the KGB troops. Rasul returned fire, and the screams of dying men nearly equaled the ear-splitting fire alarm klaxons. Tolkazi hurried over to the corner. The floor there was slicked with blood. He opened the door to the electrical fuse box, flipped the main circuit breaker, then fired his pistol into the box. Whoever tried to set things aright would also have to work in the dark. He was done. Ibrahim saw that his massive friend had been mortally hit in the chest by grenade fragments. He was wobbling, struggling to stay erect at the door, guarding his comrades to the last. "I take refuge in the Lord of the Worlds," Tolkazi called out defiantly to the security troops, who spoke not a word of Arabic. "The King of Men, the God of Men, from the evil of the Whispering Devil." The KGB sergeant leaped around the lower landing, and his first burst tore the rifle from Rasul's bloodless hands. 2 hand grenades arched through the air as the sergeant disappeared back around the corner. There was no place and no reason to run. Mohammed and Ibrahim stood immobile in the doorway as the grenades bounced and skittered across the tiled floor. Around them, the whole world seemed to be catching fire. And because of them, the whole world really would. Allahu Akbar! Sunnyvale, California. God Almighty, the Chief Master Sergeant breathed. The fire, which had begun in the gasoline diesel section of the refinery, had been sufficient to alert a strategic early warning satellite in geosynchronous orbit 24,000 miles above the Indian Ocean. The signal was downlinked to a top-security U.S. Air Force post. The senior watch officer in the satellite control facility was an Air Force colonel. He turned to his senior technician. "Map it." "Yes, sir." The sergeant typed a command into his console, which told the satellite cameras to alter their sensitivity. With the flaring on the screen reduced, the satellite rapidly pinpointed the source of the thermal energy. A computer-controlled map on the screen adjacent to the visual display gave them an exact location reference. "Sir, that's an oil refinery fire. Jeez, and it looks like a real pisser. Colonel, we got a Big Bird pass in 20 minutes, and the course track is within 120 kilometers. Uh-huh, the colonel nodded. He watched the screen closely to make sure that the heat source was not moving, his right hand lifting the gold phone to NORAD headquarters, Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado. "This is Argus Control. I have flash traffic for Sync NORAD." "Wait one," said the first voice. "This is Sync NORAD," said the second, Commander-in-Chief of the North American Aerospace Defense Command. "Sir, this is Colonel Burnett at Argus Control. We show a massive thermal energy reading at coordinates 60 degrees, 50 minutes north, 76 degrees, 40 minutes east. The site is listed as a POL refinery. The thermal source is not, repeat, not moving. We have a KH-11 pass close to the source in 20 minutes. My preliminary evaluation, General, is that we have a major oil field fire here." "They're not doing a laser flash on your bird?" Sync NORAD asked. There was always a possibility the Soviets were trying to play games with their satellite. "Negative. The light source covers infrared and all of the visible spectrum. Not, repeat, not monochromatic. We'll know more in a few minutes, sir. So far, everything is consistent with a massive ground fire." 30 minutes later, they were sure. The KH-11 reconnaissance satellite came over the horizon close enough for all of its 8 television cameras to catalog the chaos. A side link transmitted the signal to a geosynchronous communications satellite, and Burnett was able to watch it all in real time, live and in color. The fire had already engulfed half of the refinery complex and more than half of the nearby production field, with more burning crude oil spreading from the ruptured pipeline onto the River Ob. They were able to watch the fire spread. The flames carried rapidly before a 40-knot surface wind. Smoke obscured much of the area on visible light, but infrared sensors penetrated it to show many heat sources that could only be vast pools of oil products burning intensely on the ground. Burnett Sargent was from East Texas and had worked as a boy in the oil fields. He keyed up daylight photographs of the site and compared them with the adjacent visual display to determine what parts of the refinery had already ignited. "God damn, Colonel." The sergeant shook his head reverently. He spoke with quiet expertise. "The refinery? Well, it's gone, sir. That fire will spread in front of that wind, and ain't no way in hell they'll stop it. The refinery's gone. Total loss. Burned maybe 3-4 days, maybe a week, parts of it. And unless they find a way to stop it, looks like the production field is going to go too, sir. By next pass, sir, it'll all be burning, all those wellheads spilling burning oil. Lord, I don't even think Red Adair would want any part of this job. Nothing left of the refinery. Burnett watched a tape rerun of the Big Bird Pass. It's their newest and biggest. Ought to put a dent in their POL production while they rebuild that from scratch. And once they get those field fires put out, they'll have to rearrange their gas and diesel production quite a bit. I'll say one thing for Ivan. When he has an industrial accident, he doesn't screw around. A major inconvenience for our Russian friend, Sergeant. This analysis was confirmed the next day by the CIA, and the day after that by the British and French security services. They were all wrong. Chapter 2. Odd Man In. Date, time, 1/31/615. Copy 1 of 1. Soviet Fire, DC, Soviet Fire, BJT, 1809, FL. Disastrous fire reported in Soviet Nizhnevartovsk oil field, FL. EDS. Moved in advance for Wednesday PMS, FL, by William Blake, FC, AP Military Intelligence Writer. Washington, AP. The most serious oil field fire since the Mexico City disaster of 1984, or even the Texas City fire of 1947, sundered the darkness in the central region of the Soviet Union today, according to military and intelligence sources in Washington. The fire was detected by American National Technical Means, a term that generally denotes reconnaissance satellites operated by the Central Intelligence Agency. CIA sources declined comment on the incident. Sources in the Pentagon confirmed this report, noting that the energy given off by the fire was sufficient to cause a brief stir in the North American Aerospace Defense Command, which was concerned that the fire was a possible missile launch directed at the United States, or an attempt to blind American early warning satellites with a laser or other ground-based device. At no time, the source pointed out, was there any thought of increasing American alert levels, or of bringing American nuclear forces to higher states of readiness. It was all over in less than 30 minutes, the source said. No confirmation was received from the Russian news agency TASS, but the Soviets rarely publish reports of such incidents. The fact that American officials referred to two epic industrial accidents is an indication that many fatalities might result from this major fire. Defense sources were unwilling to speculate on the possibility of civilian casualties. The city of Nizhnevartovsk is bordered by the petroleum complex. The Nizhnevartovsk oil production field accounts for roughly 31.3% of total Soviet crude oil, according to the American Petroleum Institute, and the adjacent newly built Nizhnevartovsk refinery for approximately 17.3% of petroleum distillate production. Fortunately for them, Donald Evans, a spokesman for the institute explained. Oil underground is pretty hard to burn, and you can expect the fire to burn itself out in a few days. The refinery, however, depending on how much of it was involved, could be a major expense. When they usually go pretty big, Evans said. But the Russians have sufficient excess refining capacity to take up the slack, especially with all the work they've been doing at their Moscow complex. Evans was unable to speculate on the cause of the fire, saying, "The climate could have something to do with it. We had a few problems in the Alaskan fields that took some careful work to solve. Beyond that, any refinery is a potential Disneyland for fire, and there simply is no substitute for intelligent, careful, well-trained crews to run them." This is the latest in a series of setbacks to the Soviet oil industry. It was admitted only last fall at the plenum of the Communist Party Central Committee that production goals in both the eastern Siberian fields had not entirely fulfilled earlier hopes. This seemingly mild statement is being seen in Western circles as a stinging indictment of the policies of now-departed Petroleum Industry Minister Zatizhin, since replaced by Mikhail Sergetov, former chief of the Leningrad party apparatus, regarded as a rising star in the Soviet Party. A technocrat with a background of engineering and party work, Sergetov's task of reorganizing the Soviet oil industry is seen as a task that could last years. APBA 0131, 0501 ESTFL, end of story. Moscow, RSFSR. Mikhail Eduardovich Sergetov never had a chance to read the wire service report. Summoned from his official dacha in the birch forests surrounding Moscow, he'd flown at once to Nizhnevartovsk and stayed for only 10 hours before being recalled to make his report in Moscow. 3 months on the job, he thought, sitting in the empty forward cabin of the IL-86 airliner, and this has to happen. His two principal deputies, a pair of skilled young engineers, had been left behind and were trying even now to make sense of the chaos, to save what could be saved, as he reviewed his notes for the Politburo meeting later in the day. 300 men were known to have died fighting the fire, and, miraculously, fewer than 200 citizens in the city of Nizhnevartovsk. That was unfortunate, but not a matter of great significance, except insofar as those trained men killed would eventually have to be replaced by other trained men drawn from the staffs of other large refineries. The refinery was almost totally destroyed. Reconstruction would take a minimum of 2 to 3 years, and would account for a sizable percentage of national steel pipe production, plus all the other specialty items unique to a facility of this type. 15,000 million rubles. And how much of the special equipment would have to be purchased from foreign sources?
Rearming complete.
How much precious hard currency and gold would be wasted? And that was the good news. The bad news? The fire that had engulfed the production field had totally destroyed the well tops. Time to replace? At least 36 months. 36 months, Sergetov reflected bleakly. If we can divert the drill rigs and crews to re-drill every damned well, and at the same time rebuild the EOR systems. For a minimum of 18 months, the Soviet Union will have an enormous shortfall in oil production.
Roll left.
Probably more like 30 months.
Controls.
What will happen to our economy? He pulled a pad of lined paper from his briefcase and began to make some calculations. It was a 3-hour flight, and Sergetov did not notice it was over until the pilot came back to announce they had landed. He looked with squinted eyes at the snow-covered landscape of Vnukovo II, the VIP-only airport outside of Moscow, and walked alone down the boarding stairs to a waiting Zeal limousine. The car sped off at once, without stopping at any of the security checkpoints. The shivering militia officers snapped to attention as the Zeal passed, then returned to the business of keeping warm in the sub-zero temperatures. The sun was bright, the sky clear but for some thin high clouds. Sergetov looked vacantly out the windows. his mind mulling over figures he had already rechecked a half-dozen times. The Politburo was waiting for him, his KGB driver told him. Sergetov had been a candidate, or non-voting member, of the Politburo for just 6 months, which meant that, along with his 8 other junior colleagues, he advised the 13 men who alone made the decisions that mattered in the Soviet Union. His portfolio was energy production and distribution. He had held that post since September, and was only beginning to establish his plan for a total reorganization of the 7 regional and all-union ministries that handled energy functions, and predictably spent most of their time battling one another into a full department that reported directly to the Politburo and Party Secretariat, instead of having to work through the Council of Ministers bureaucracy. He briefly closed his eyes to thank God. There might be one, he reasoned, that his first recommendation, delivered only a month earlier, had concerned security and political reliability in many of the fields. He had specifically recommended further Russification of the largely foreign workforce. For this reason, he did not fear for his own career, which up to now had been an uninterrupted success story. He shrugged. The task he was about to face would decide his future in any case, and perhaps his country's. The Zeal proceeded down Leningradsky Prospect, which turned into Gorkogo, the limousine speeding through the center lane that policemen kept clear of traffic for the exclusive use of the Vlasti. They motored past the Inn-Tourist Hotel into Red Square, and finally approached the Kremlin Gate. Here the driver did stop for the security checks, 3 of them, conducted by KGB troops and soldiers of the Taman Guards. 5 minutes later, the limousine pulled to the door of the Council of Ministers building, the sole modern structure in the fortress. The guards here knew Sergetov by sight, and saluted crisply as they held open the door so that his exposure to the freezing temperatures would last but a brief span of seconds. The Politburo had been holding its meetings in this 4th-floor room for only a month, while their usual quarters in the old Arsenal building were undergoing a belated renovation. The older men grumbled at the loss of the old Tsarist comforts, but Sergetov preferred the modernity. About time, he thought, that the men of the party surrounded themselves with the works of socialism instead of the moldy trappings of the Romanovs. The room was deathly quiet as he entered. Had this been in the Arsenal, the 54-year-old technocrat reflected, the atmosphere would have been altogether like a funeral, and there had been all too many of those. Slowly, the party was running out of the old men who had survived Stalin's terror, and the current crop of members, all young men in their 50s or early 60s, was finally being heard. The guard was being changed. Too slowly, too damned slowly, for Sergetov and his generation of party leaders, despite the new general secretary. The man was already a grandfather. It sometimes seemed to Sergetov that by the time these old men were gone, he'd be one himself. But looking around this room now, he felt young enough. "Good day, comrades," Sergetov said, handing his coat to an aide, who withdrew at once, closing the doors behind him. The other men moved at once to their seats. Sergetov took his, halfway down the right side. The party general secretary brought the meeting to order. His voice was controlled and businesslike. "Comrade Sergetov, you may begin your report. First, we wish to hear your explanation of exactly what happened." "Comrades, at approximately 2300 hours yesterday, Moscow time, 3 armed men entered the central control complex of the Nizhnevartovsk oil complex and committed a highly sophisticated act of sabotage." "Who were they?" the defense minister asked sharply. "We only have identification for 2 of them. One of the bandits was a staff electrician. The third," Sergetov pulled the ID card from his pocket and tossed it on the table, "was senior engineer I.M. Tolkazy. He evidently used his expert knowledge of the control systems to initiate a massive fire which spread rapidly before high winds. A security team of 10 KGB border guards responded at once to the alarm. The one traitor still unidentified killed or wounded 5 of these with a rifle taken from the building guard, who was also shot. I must say, having interviewed the KGB sergeant, the lieutenant was killed leading his men, that the border guards responded quickly and well. They killed the traitors within minutes, but were unable to prevent the complete destruction of the facility, both the refinery and production fields. And if the guards responded so fast, how then did they fail to prevent this act? The defense minister demanded angrily. He examined the photographic pass with palpable hatred in his eyes. What was this black-ass Muslim doing there in the first place? Comrade, work in the Siberian fields is arduous, and we have had serious difficulties in filling the posts we have there. My predecessor decided to conscript experienced oil field workers from the Baku region to Siberia. This was madness. You will recall that my first recommendation last year was to change this policy. We have noted it, Mikhail Eduardovich, the chairman said. Go on. The guard post records all telephone and radio traffic. The response team was moving in under 2 minutes. Unfortunately, the guard post is located adjacent to the original control building. The current building was constructed 3 kilometers away when new computerized control equipment was obtained from the west 2 years ago. A new guard post was also supposed to have been built, and the proper materials were allocated for this purpose. It would appear that these building materials were misappropriated by the complex director and local party secretary for the purpose of building dachas on the river a few kilometers away. Both of these men have been arrested by my order for crimes against the state, Sergetov reported matter-of-factly. There was no reaction around the table. By unspoken consensus, those 2 men were sentenced to death. The formalities would be worked out by the proper ministries. Sergetov continued. I have already ordered greatly increased security at all petroleum sites. Also, on my orders, the families of the 2 known traitors have been arrested at their homes outside Baku and are being rigorously interrogated by state security, along with all who knew and worked with them. Before the border guards were able to kill the traitors, they were able to sabotage the oil field control systems in such a way as to create a massive conflagration. They were also able to wreck the control equipment so that even if the guard troops had been able to get a crew of engineers in to restore control, it is unlikely that anything would have been saved. The KGB troops were forced to evacuate the building, which was later consumed by the fire. There was nothing more they could have done. Sergetov remembered the sergeant's badly burned face, the tears flowing down over the blisters as he told his story. The fire brigade? The general secretary asked. More than half of them died fighting the fire, Sergetov replied, along with over 100 citizens who joined the battle to save the complex. Truly, there is no blame to be assessed here, comrade. Once this bastard Tolkazi began his devil's work, it would have been as easy to control an earthquake. For the most part, the fire has been put out by now, due to the fact that most of the fuels stored in the refinery were consumed in about 5 hours. Also because of the destruction of the wellheads in the oil field. But how was this catastrophe possible? A senior member asked. Sergetov was surprised by the quiet mood in the room. Had they met and discussed this affair already? My report of December 20th described the dangers here. This room quite literally controlled the pumps and valves for over 100 square kilometers. The same is true of all of our large oil complexes. From the nerve center, a man familiar with control procedures could manipulate the various systems throughout the field at will, causing the entire complex quite simply to self-destruct. Tolkazi had such skill. He was an Azerbaijani chosen for special treatment for his intelligence and supposed loyalty, an honor student educated at Moscow State University, and a member in good standing of the local party. It would also seem that he was a religious fanatic capable of astounding treachery. All the people killed in the control room were friends of his, or so they thought. After 15 years in the party, a good salary, the professional respect of his comrades, even his own automobile, his last words were a shrill cry to Allah, Sergetov said dryly. The reliability of people from that region cannot be accurately predicted, comrades. The defense minister nodded again.
6,000.
So, what effect will this have on oil production? Half the men at the table leaned forward to hear Sergetov's answer. Comrades, we have lost 34% of our total crude oil production for a period of at least 1 year. Possibly as many as 3. Sergetov looked up from his notes to see the impassive faces cringe as though from a slap. It will be necessary to re-drill every production well and finally reconstruct the pipelines from the fields to the refinery and elsewhere. The concurrent loss of the refinery is serious, but not an immediate concern, since the refinery can be rebuilt, and in any case represents less than 1/7 of our total refining capacity. The major injury to our economy will come from the loss of our crude oil production. In real terms, due to the chemical makeup of the Nizhnevartovsk oil, the net total production loss understates the actual impact on our economy. Siberian oil is light, sweet crude, which means that it contains a disproportionately large amount of the most valuable fractions, those which we use to make gasoline, kerosene, and diesel fuel, for example. The net loss in these particular areas is 44% of our gasoline production, 48% of kerosene, and 50% of diesel. These figures are rough calculations I made on the flight back, but they should be accurate to within 2%. My staff will have more precise figures ready in a day or so. Half, the General Secretary asked quietly. Correct, comrade, Sergetov responded. And how long to restore production? Comrade General Secretary, if we bring in every drilling rig and operate them around the clock, my rough estimate is that we can begin to restore production in 12 months. Clearing the site of wreckage will take at least 3 months, and another 3 will be needed to relocate our equipment and commence drilling operations. Since we have exact information for well locations and depths, the usual element of uncertainty is not part of the equation. Within a year, that is 6 months after we commence the re-drilling, we will begin to bring the production wells back on stream, and full restoration of the wells will be achieved within 2 more years. While all this is going on, we will need to replace the EOR equipment also. And what might that be? Defense asked. Enhanced oil recovery systems, Comrade Minister. Had these been relatively new wells, pressurized from underground gas, the fires might have lasted for weeks. As you know, comrades, these are wells from which a good deal of oil has already been extracted. To enhance production, we have been pumping water into the wells, which has the effect of forcing more oil out. It may also have had the effect of damaging the oil-bearing strata. This is something our geologists are even now attempting to evaluate. As it was, when power was lost, the force driving the oil from the ground was removed, and the fires in the production fields rapidly began to run out of fuel. They were, for the most part, dying out when my flight left for Moscow. So, even 3 years from now, production may not be completely restored? The Minister of the Interior asked. Correct, Comrade Minister. There is simply no scientific basis for making an estimate of total production. The situation we have here has never happened before, either in the West or the East. We can drill some test wells in the next 2 or 3 months that will give us some indications. The staff engineers I left behind are making arrangements to begin the process as quickly as possible with equipment already at the site. Very well. The General Secretary nodded. The next question is how long the country can operate on this basis. Sergetov went back to his notes. Comrades, there is no denying that this is a disaster of unprecedented scale for our economy. The winter has drawn down our heavy oil inventories more than usual. Certain energy expenditures must remain relatively intact. Electrical power generation last year, for example, accounted for 38% of our oil products, far more than planned, due to past disappointments in coal and gas production, which we had expected to reduce oil demand. The coal industry will require at least 5 years to restore due to failures in modernization. And gas drilling operations are currently slowed by environmental conditions. For technical reasons, it is extremely hard to operate such equipment in extreme cold weather. So make those lazy bastards on the drilling crews work harder, suggested the chief of the Moscow party. It is not the workers, comrade, Sergatov sighed. It is the machines. Cold temperature affects metal more than men. Tools and equipment break simply because they are brittle with cold. Weather conditions make resupply of spare parts to the camps more difficult. Marxism-Leninism cannot dictate the weather. How difficult would it be to conceal the drilling operations? Defense asked. Sergatov was surprised. Difficult? No, Comrade Minister, impossible. How can one conceal several hundred drilling rigs, each 20 to 40 meters high? One might as easily attempt to conceal Plesetsk's missile launch complexes. Sergatov noticed for the first time the glances being exchanged by Defense and the General Secretary. Then we must reduce the consumption of oil by the electrical industry, the General Secretary pronounced. Comrades, allow me to give you some rough figures on the way in which we consume our oil products. Please understand that I am going from memory since the annual departmental report is in the process of formulation at this time. Last year, we produced 589 million tons of crude oil. This fell short of planned production by 32 million tons, and the amount actually produced was only possible due to the artificial measures that I have already discussed. Roughly half of that production was semi-refined into mazout, or heavy fuel oil, for use in electrical power plants, factory boilers, and the like. Most of this oil simply cannot be used otherwise, since we have only now only two, refineries with the sophisticated catalytic cracking chambers needed to refine heavy oil into light distillate products. The fuels we produce serve our economy in many ways. As we have already seen, 38% goes for electrical and other forms of power generation, and fortunately, much of this is mazout. Of the lighter fuels, diesel, gasoline, and kerosene, agricultural production and the food industries, transportation of goods and commodities, public consumption and passenger transportation, and finally, military uses, these alone absorbed more than half of last year's production. In other words, comrades, with the loss of the Nizhnevartovsk field, the end users I just mentioned account for more than we are able to produce, leaving nothing at all for metallurgy, heavy machinery, chemical, and construction uses. Not to mention what we customarily export to our fraternal socialist allies in Eastern Europe and throughout the world. To answer your specific question, Comrade General Secretary, we can make perhaps a modest reduction in the use of light oils in electrical power usage. But even now we have a serious shortfall in electrical power production, resulting in occasional brownouts and complete power outages. Further cuts in power generation will adversely affect such crucial state activities as factory production and rail transport. You will recall that 3 years ago we experimented with altering the voltage of generated power to conserve fuels, and this resulted in damage to electric motors throughout the Donetsk industrial basin. What about coal and gas? Comrade General Secretary, coal production is already 16% below planned output, and getting worse, which has caused conversion of many coal-fired boilers and power plants to oil. Moreover, the conversion of such facilities from oil back to coal is costly and time-consuming. Conversion to gas is a much more attractive and cheaper alternative that we have been vigorously pursuing. Gas production is also under plan, but it is improving. We had expected to exceed planned targets later this year. Here we must also account for the fact that much of our gas goes to Western Europe. It is from this that we gain Western currency with which to purchase foreign oil and, of course, foreign grain. The Politburo member in charge of agriculture winced at this reference. How many men, Sergetov wondered, had been done in by their inability to make the Soviet agricultural industry perform? Not the current General Secretary, of course, who had somehow managed to advance despite his failures there. But good Marxists weren't supposed to believe in miracles. His elevation to the titular chairmanship had had its own price, one which Sergetov was only beginning to understand.
Altitude.
So, what is your solution, Mikhail Eduardovich? The defense minister inquired with unsettling solicitude. Comrades, we must bear this burden as best we can, improving efficiency at every level of our economy. Sergetov didn't bother talking about increasing imports of oil. The shortfall, he had explained, would result in more than a 30-fold increase in imports, and hard currency reserves would scarcely allow a doubling of foreign oil purchases. We will need to increase production and quality control at the Barricade drilling rig factory in Volgograd, and to purchase more drilling equipment from the West, so that we can expand exploration and exploitation of known fields. And we need to expand our construction of nuclear reactor plants. To conserve what production we do have, we can restrict supplies available to trucks and personal automobiles. There is much waste in this sector, as we all know, perhaps as much as a third of total usage. We can temporarily reduce the amount of fuel consumed by the military, and perhaps also divert some heavy machine production from military hardware to necessary industrial areas. We face 3 very hard years, but only 3, Sergetov summarized on an upbeat note. Comrade, your experience in foreign and defense areas is slim, no? The defense minister asked. I have never pretended otherwise, Comrade Minister, Sergetov answered warily. Then I will tell you why this situation is unacceptable. If we do what you suggest, the West will learn of our crisis. Increased purchases of oil production equipment and unconcealable signs of activity at Nizhnevartovsk will demonstrate to them all too clearly what is happening here. That will make us vulnerable in their eyes. Such vulnerability will be exploited. And at the same time, he pounded his fist on the heavy oak table, you propose reducing the fuel available to the forces who defend us against the West. Comrade Defense Minister, I am an engineer, not a soldier. You asked me for a technical evaluation, and I gave it. Sergetov and his voice reasoned. This situation is very serious, but it does not, for example, affect our strategic rocket forces. Cannot they alone shield us against the imperialists during our recovery period? Why else had they been built? Sergetov asked himself. All that money sunk into unproductive holes. Wasn't it enough to be able to kill the West 10 times over? Why 20 times? And now this wasn't enough? And it has not occurred to you that the West will not allow us to purchase what we need? The party theoretician asked. When have the capitalists refused to sell us? When have the capitalists had such a weapon to use against us? The General Secretary observed. For the first time, the West has the ability to strangle us in a single year. What if now they also prevent our purchase of grain?
Request refueling.
Sergetov hadn't considered that. With yet another disappointing grain harvest, the 7th out of the last 11 years, the Soviet Union needed to make massive purchases of wheat. And this year, America and Canada were the only reliable sources. Bad weather in the southern hemisphere had damaged Argentina's harvest, and, to a lesser extent, Australia's. while the U.S. and Canada had enjoyed their customary record crops. Negotiations were even now underway in Washington and Ottawa to secure such a purchase, and the Americans were making no trouble at all, except that the high value of the dollar made their grain disproportionately expensive. But that grain would take months to ship. How easy would it be, Sergeytov wondered, for technical difficulties in the grain ports of New Orleans and Baltimore to slow or even stop shipments entirely at a crucial moment?
Flight
He
controls.
looked around the table.
Flight controls.
22 men, of whom only 13 really decided matters, and one of those was missing, were silently contemplating the prospect of over 250 million Soviet workers and peasants, all hungry and in the dark, at the same time that the troops of the Red Army, the Ministry of the Interior, and the KGB found their own fuel supplies,
Rearming complete.
and, because of it, their training and mobility restricted. The men of the Politburo were among the most powerful in the world, far more so than any of their Western counterparts. They answered to no one, not the Central Committee of the Communist Party, not the Supreme Soviet, certainly not the people of their nation. These men had not walked on the streets of Moscow for years, but been whisked by chauffeured, handmade cars to and from their luxury apartments within Moscow, or to their ceremonial dachas outside the city. They shopped, if at all, in guarded stores restricted to the elite, were served by doctors in clinics established only for the elite. Because of all this, these men regarded themselves as masters of their destiny. It was only now beginning to strike them that, like all men, they too were subject to a fate which their immense personal power merely made all the more intractable. Around them was a country whose citizens were poorly fed and poorly housed, whose only abundant commodities were the painted signs and slogans praising Soviet progress and solidarity. Some of the men at this table actually believed those slogans, Sergeytov knew. Sometimes he still did, mainly in homage to his idealistic youth. But Soviet progress had not fed their nation. And how long would Soviet solidarity endure in the hearts of people hungry, cold, in the dark? Would they be proud of the missiles in the Siberian forests then? Of the thousands of tanks and guns produced every year? Would they then look to the sky that held a Salyut space station and feel inspired? Or would they wonder what kind of food was being eaten by that elite? Less than a year before, Sergeytov had been a regional party chieftain, and in Leningrad, he had been careful to listen to his own staff people's description of the jokes and grumblings in the lines which people endured for 2 loaves of bread, or toothpaste, or shoes. Detached even then from the harsher realities of life in the Soviet Union, he had often wondered if one day the burden of the ordinary worker would become too heavy to endure. How would he have known then? How would he know now? Would the older men here ever know? Narod, they called it. A masculine noun that was nonetheless raped in every sense. The masses, the faceless collection of men and women who toiled every day in Moscow and throughout the nation in factories and on collective farms, their thoughts hidden behind unsmiling masks. The members of the Politburo told themselves that these workers and peasants did not grudge their leaders the luxuries that accompanied responsibility. After all, life in the country had improved in measurable terms. That was the compact. But the compact was about to be broken. What might happen then? Nicholas II had not known. These men did. The defense minister broke the silence. We must obtain more oil. It is as simple as that. The alternative is a crippled economy, hungry citizens, and reduced defense capacity, the consequences of which are not acceptable. We cannot purchase oil, a candidate member pointed out. Then we must take it. Fort Meade, Maryland. Bob Toland frowned at his spice cake. I shouldn't be eating dessert, the intelligence analyst reminded himself. But the National Security Agency commissary served this only once a week. And spice cake was his favorite. And it was only about 200 calories. That was all. An extra 5 minutes on the exercise bike when he got home. What did you think of that article in the paper, Bob? A co-worker asked. The oil field thing? Toland rechecked the man's security badge. He wasn't cleared for satellite intelligence. Sounds like they had themselves quite a fire. You didn't see anything official on it. Let's just say that the leak in the papers came from a higher security clearance than I have. Top secret? Press? Both men laughed. Something like that. The story had information that I haven't seen, Toland said. Speaking the truth, mostly. The fire was out, and people in his department had been speculating on how Ivan had put it out so fast. Shouldn't hurt them too bad. I mean, they don't have millions of people taking to the road on summer vacations, do they? Not hardly. How's the cake? Not bad. Toland smiled, already wondering if he needed the extra time on the bike. Moscow, RSFSR. The Politburo reconvened at 9:30 the next morning. The sky outside the double-paned windows was gray and curtained with the heavy snow that was beginning to fall again, adding to the half-meter already on the ground. There would be sledding tonight on the hills of Gorky Park, Sergeytov thought. The snow would be cleared off the 2 frozen lakes for skating under the lights to the music of Tchaikovsky and Prokofiev. Muscovites would laugh and drink their vodka and savor the cold, blissfully ignorant of what was about to be said here, of the turns that all of their lives would take. The main body of the Politburo had adjourned at 4 the previous afternoon. And then the 5 men who made up the Defense Council had met alone. Not even all of the full Politburo members were privy to that decision-making body. Overseeing them at the far end of the room was a full-length portrait of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin, the revolutionary saint of Soviet communism, his domed forehead thrown back as though in a fresh breeze, his piercing eyes looking off toward the glorious future which his stern face confidently proclaimed, which the science of Marxism-Leninism called an historic inevitability. A glorious future. Which future? Sergeytov asked himself. What has become of our revolution? What has become of our party? Did Comrade Ilyich really mean it to be like this? Sergeytov looked at the General Secretary, the young man, supposed by the West to be fully in charge, the man who was even now changing things. His accession to the highest post in the party had been a surprise to some, Sergeytov among them. The West still looked to him as hopefully as we once had, Sergeytov thought. His own arrival in Moscow had changed that rapidly enough. Yet another broken dream. The man who had put a happy face on years of agricultural failure now applied his superficial charm to a larger arena. He was laboring mightily. Anyone at this table would admit that. But his task was an impossible one. To get here, he had been forced to make too many promises, too many deals with the old guard. Even the young men of 50 and 60 he'd added to the Politburo had their own ties to former regimes. Nothing had really changed. The West never seemed to absorb the idea. Not since Khrushchev had one-man held sway. One-man rule held dangers vividly remembered by the older generation of the party. The younger men had heard the tales of the great purges under Stalin often enough to take the lesson to heart. And the army had its own institutional memory of what Khrushchev had done to its hierarchy. In the Politburo, as in the jungle, the only rule was survival. And for all, collective safety lay in collective rule. Because of this, the men selected for the titular post of General Secretary were not elected so much for their personal dynamism as for their experience in the party. An organization that did not reward people for standing out too distinctly from the crowd. Like Brezhnev and Stalin and Chernenko, the current chief of the party lacked the power of personality to dominate this room with his will alone. He'd had to compromise to be in his chair, and he would have to compromise to remain there. The real power blocks were amorphous things, relationships among men, loyalties that changed with circumstance and knew only expediency. The real power lay within the party itself. The party ruled all, but the party was no longer the expression of one man. It had become a collection of interests represented here by 12 other men. Defense had its interest, the KGB, and heavy industry, and even agriculture. Each interest held its own brand of power, and the chief of each allied himself with others in order to secure his own place. The General Secretary would try to change this, would gradually appoint men loyal to himself to the posts that death made vacant. Would he then learn, as his predecessors had, that loyalty so easily died around this table? For now, he still carried the burden of his own compromises. With his own men not yet fully in place, the General Secretary was only the foremost member of a group that could unseat him as easily as it had unseated Khrushchev. What would the West say if it learned that the dynamic General Secretary mainly served as executor for the decisions of others? Even now, he did not speak first. "Comrades," began the defense minister, "the Soviet Union must have oil, at least 200 million tons more than we can produce. Such oil exists only a few hundred kilometers from our border in the Persian Gulf. More oil than we will ever need. We have the ability to take it, of course. Inside of 2 weeks, we could assemble enough aircraft and airborne troops to swoop down on those oil fields and gobble them up. Unfortunately, there could not fail to be a violent Western response. Those same oil fields supply Western Europe, Japan, and, to a lesser extent, America. The NATO countries do not have the ability to defend those fields with conventional means. The Americans have their rapid deployment force, a hollow shell of headquarters, and a few light troops. Even with their pre-positioned equipment at Diego Garcia, they could not hope to stop our airborne and mechanized forces. Were they to try, and they would have to try, their elite troops would be overwhelmed and exterminated in a few days. And they would be faced with a single alternative: nuclear weapons. This is a real risk that we cannot disregard. We know for a fact that American war plans call for nuclear weapons in this case. Such weapons are stored in quantity at Diego Garcia and would almost certainly be used. Therefore, before we can seize the Persian Gulf, we must first do one other thing. We must eliminate NATO as a political and military force. Sergeytov sat upright in his leather chair. What was this? What was he saying? He struggled to keep his face impassive as the defense minister continued.
If NATO is first removed from the board, America will be in a most curious position. The United States will be able to meet its own energy needs from Western Hemisphere sources, removing the need to defend the Arab states, who are in any case not terribly popular with the American Jewish Zionist community.
Did they really believe this? Sergeytov wondered. Did they actually believe the United States would sit on its hands? What went on at the late meeting yesterday? At last, one other person shared his concern. So the only thing we have to do is conquer Western Europe, comrade?" a candidate member asked. "Are these not the countries against whose conventional forces you warn us every year? Every year you tell us of the threat the massed NATO armies present to us. And now you say casually that we must conquer them? Excuse me, Comrade Defense Minister, but do not France and England have their own nuclear arsenals? And why would America not fulfill its treaty promise to use nuclear weapons in the defense of NATO?" Sergeytov was surprised that a junior member had put the issues so quickly on the table. He was more surprised that the foreign minister answered. So, another piece of the puzzle. But what did the KGB think of this? Why were they not represented here? The chairman was recovering from surgery, but there should have been someone here, unless that had been taken care of last night. Our objectives must be limited, and obviously so. This presents us with several political tasks. First, we must engender a feeling of security in America, to put them off guard until it is too late for them to react forcefully. Second, we must attempt to unravel the NATO alliance in a political sense. The foreign minister ventured a rare smile. As you know, the KGB has been working on such a plan for the past several years. It is now in its final form. I will outline it for you. He did so, and Sergeytov nodded at its audacity, and also with a new understanding of the power balance in this room. So, it was the KGB. He should have known. But would the rest of the Politburo fall in line? The minister went on. You see how it would work. One piece after another would fall into place. Given these preconditions, the waters so thoroughly muddied, and the fact that we would proclaim our unwillingness to threaten directly the two independent NATO nuclear powers, we feel that the nuclear risk, while real, is less than the risk that we already face in our economy. Sergeytov leaned back in his leather chair. So, there it was. War was less risky than a cold, hungry peace. It had been decided. Or had it? Might some combination of other Politburo members have the power or prestige to reverse that decision?
Copy.
Could he dare to speak out against this madness? Perhaps a judicious question first. Do we have the ability to defeat NATO? He was chilled by the glib reply. Of course, Defense answered. What do you think we have an army for? We have already consulted with our senior commanders. And when you asked us last month for more steel for more new tanks, Comrade Defense Minister, was your excuse that NATO was too weak? Sergeytov asked himself angrily. What machinations had taken place? Have they even spoken with their military advisors yet? Or had the Defense Minister exploited his vaunted personal expertise? Had the General Secretary allowed himself to be bullied by Defense and by the Foreign Minister? Had he even objected? Was this how the decisions were made to decide the fate of nations? What would Vladimir Ilyich have thought of this?
Flight controls.
Comrades, this is madness, said Pyotr Bromkovsky. The oldest man there, frail and past 80. His conversation occasionally rambled about the idealistic times long before, when Communist Party members really believed that they were the leading wave of history. The Yezhovshchina purges had ended that.
Rearming
Yes,
complete.
we have a grave economic danger. Yes, we have a grave danger to the security of the state. But do we replace this with a greater danger? Consider what can happen. How long, Comrade Defense Minister, before you can initiate your conquest of NATO? I am assured that we can have our army fully ready for combat operations in 4 months. 4 months. I presume that we will have fuel 4 months from now. Enough fuel to begin a war. Petya was old, but no one's fool. Comrade Sergeytov. The General Secretary gestured down the table, dodging his responsibility yet again. Which side to take? The young candidate member made a swift decision. Inventories of light fuels, gasoline, diesel, etc., are high at the moment, Sergetov had to admit. We always use the cold weather months, the time when usage of these fuels is lowest, to build up our stocks. And added to this are our strategic defense reserves. Enough for 45... 60, insisted the defense minister. 45 days is a more realistic figure, comrade. Sergetov held his position. My department has studied fuel consumption by military units as part of a program to increase the strategic fuel reserves, something neglected in past years. With savings in other consumption and certain industrial sacrifices, we might expand this to 60 days of war stocks, perhaps even 70, plus giving you other stocks to expand training exercises. The near-term economic costs would be slight, but by midsummer this would change rapidly. Sergetov paused, greatly disturbed at how easily he had gone along with the unspoken decision. I have sold my soul. Or have I acted like a patriot? Have I become like the other men around this table? Or have I merely told the truth? And what is truth? All he could be certain of, he told himself, is that he had survived. For now. We do have the limited ability, as I told you yesterday, to restructure our distillate production. In this case, my staff feels that a 9% increase in the militarily important fuels can be accomplished, based on our reduced production. I caution, however, that my staff analysts also feel that all existing estimates of fuel usage in combat conditions are grossly optimistic. A last feeble attempt at protest. Give us the fuel, Mikhail Eduardovich, the defense minister smiled coldly, and we'll see it is properly used. My analysts estimate that we can accomplish our goals in 2 weeks, perhaps less. But I will grant you the strength of the NATO armies and double our estimates to 30 days. We will still have more than enough. And what if NATO discovers our intentions? Old Petya demanded. They will not. Already we are preparing our maskirovka, our trickery. NATO is not a strong alliance. It cannot be. The ministers bicker over each country's defense contribution. Their peoples are divided and soft. They cannot standardize their weapons, and because of it, their supply situation is utter chaos. And their most important, most powerful member is separated from Europe by 5,000 kilometers of ocean. The Soviet Union is only an overnight train ride from the German border. But, Petya, my old friend, I will answer your question. If everything fails and our intentions are discovered, we can always stop. Say that we were running an exercise and return to peacetime conditions, and be no worse off than if we do nothing at all. We need strike only if all is ready. We can always draw back. Everyone at the table knew that was a lie, though a clever one, because no one had the courage to denounce it as such. What army had ever been mobilized to be called back? No one else spoke up to oppose the defense minister. Gromkovsky rambled on for a few minutes, quoting Lenin's stricture about endangering the home of world socialism. But even that drew no response. The danger to the state, actually the danger to the party and the Politburo, was manifest. It could not become graver. The alternative was war. 10 minutes later, the Politburo voted. Sergetov and his 8 fellow candidate members were mere spectators. The vote was 11-2 for war. The process had begun. Date, time, 2-3-1715, copy 1 of Soviet report. BC, Soviet report, BJT, 2310 FL. Task confirms oil field fire FL. EDS, Moved in advance for Saturday PMSFL by Patrick Flynn, FC, AP Moscow correspondent. Moscow, AP. It was confirmed today by TASS, the Soviet news agency, that a serious fire had taken place in the western Siberian region of the Soviet Union. A back-page article in Pravda, the official Communist Party newspaper, noted the fire, commenting that the heroic fire brigade had saved countless lives by its skill and devotion to duty, also preventing more serious damage to the nearby oil facilities. The fire was reportedly begun by a technical malfunction in the automatic refinery control systems and spread rapidly, but was swiftly extinguished, not without casualties among the brave men detailed to attack the fire, and the courageous workmen who raced heroically to their comrades' side. Though somewhat at odds with Western reports, the fire in the area did not go out more quickly than had been expected. Western officials are now speculating about a highly sophisticated firefighting system built into the Nizhnevartovsk facility that allowed the Soviets to extinguish the fire. AB, BA 231601, ESTFL, end of story. Chapter 3. Correlation of Forces. Moscow, RSFSR. They didn't ask me, explained Chief of the General Staff, Marshal Shavirin. They didn't ask for my evaluation. The political decision was already made when they called me in Thursday night. When was the last time the Defense Minister asked me for a substantive judgmental decision? And what did you say? Asked Marshal Rajkov, Commander-in-Chief of Ground Forces. The initial response was a grim, ironic smile. That the armed forces of the Soviet Union were able to carry out this task given 4 months of preparation. 4 months? Rajkov stared out the window. He turned back. We won't be ready. Hostilities will commence on 15 June,
Altitude.
Shavirin replied.
Altitude.
We must be ready, Yuri. And what choice did I have? Would you have had me say, I am sorry, Comrade General Secretary, but the Soviet Army is unable to carry out this task? I would have been dismissed and replaced by someone more tractable. You know who my replacement will be. Would you rather answer to Marshal Bukharin? That fool, Rajkov growled. It had been the then Lieutenant General Bukharin whose brilliant plan had led the Soviet Army into Afghanistan. Professionally a non-entity, his political connections had not only saved him, but continued his career to near the pinnacle of uniformed power. A clever man, Bukharin. Never involved in the mountain campaigns himself, he could point to his brilliant paper plan and complain that it had been poorly executed after he had moved on to command of the Kiev military district, historically the shining gate to marshal's rank. So, would you have him in this office, dictating your plans to you? Shavirin asked. Rajkov shook his head. The two men had been friends and comrades since each had commanded a tank troop in the same regiment, just in time for the final surge toward Vienna in 1945. How are we to go about it? Rajkov asked. Red Storm, the Marshal replied simply. Red Storm was the plan for a mechanized attack into West Germany and the Low Countries. Constantly updated for changes in the force structures of both sides, it called for a 2 to 3 week campaign, commencing after a rapid escalation of tension between East and West. Despite this, in accordance with standard Soviet strategic doctrine, it called for strategic surprise as a precondition for success, and the use of conventional weapons only. At least they aren't talking about atomic arms, Rajkov grunted. Other plans with other names applied to different scenarios, including many for the use of tactical and even strategic nuclear arms, something no one in uniform wished to contemplate. Despite all the saber-rattling of their political masters, these professional soldiers knew all too well that the use of nuclear arms made only for ghastly uncertainties. And the Maskirovka? In two parts. The first is purely political, to work against the United States.
Altitude.
Second part, immediately before the war begins, is from KGB. You know it, from KGB Group Nord. We reviewed it 2 years ago. Rajkov grunted. Group Nord was an ad hoc committee of KGB department chiefs, first assembled by then chief of the KGB Yuri Andropov in the mid-1970s. Its purpose was to research means of splitting the NATO alliance, and in general to conduct political and psychological operations aimed at undermining Western will. Its specific plan to shake the NATO military and political structure in preparation for a shooting war was Nord's proudest example of legerdemain. But would it work? The two senior officers shared an ironic look. Like most professional soldiers, they distrusted spies and all their plans. 4 months, Rajkov repeated. We have much to do. And if this KGB magic fails to work, it is a good plan. It need only deceive the West for a week, though 2 weeks would be better. The key, of course, is how quickly NATO can reach full readiness. If we can delay the mobilization process 7 days, victory is assured. And if not, Rajkov asked sharply, knowing that even a 7-day delay was no guarantee. Then it is not assured, but the balance of forces is on our side. You know that, Yuri. The option of recalling the mobilized forces had never been discussed with the chief of the general staff. We will need to improve discipline throughout the force, first of all, St. Brown said. And I need to inform our senior commanders at once. We need to implement intense training operations. Just how awful is this fuel problem? Shavirin handed his subordinate the notes. It could be worse. We have enough for extended unit training. Your task is no easy one, Yuri, but 4 months is a long time for this task, is it not? It wasn't, but there was no point in saying so. As you say, 4 months to instill fighting discipline. I will have a free hand. Within limits.
Altitude.
It is one thing to make a private soldier snap to the orders of his sergeant. It might be another for officers conditioned to pushing paper to change into combat leaders. Rajkov skirted the issue, but his superior received the message clearly enough. A free hand on both, Yuri, but act carefully for both our sakes. Rajkov nodded briefly. He knew whom he'd use to get this done. With the troops we led 40 years ago, Andrei, we could do this. Rajkov sat down. And in truth, we have the same raw material now that we had then, and better weapons. The chief unknown remains the men. When we drove our tanks into Vienna, our men were tough, hard veterans. And so were the SS bastards we crushed. Shavirin smiled. Remember. Keep in mind that the same forces are at work in the West, even more so. How well will they fight? Surprised, divided. It can work. We must make it work. I'm meeting with our field commanders now. I will tell them myself. Norfolk, Virginia. I hope you take good care of it, the mayor said. It was a moment